Sure thing. My turn?
Your turn.
All right, guys. All right, so we've gone through 3 sessions. The first session, we talked about what exception planning is, different in my world, at least, the difference between an error and an exception, how to prepare for those during your front-end work, your BA work, your defining of your process, your flow charting. Then last week, we went very quickly through a bunch of different exception planning tools that are available in Studio. And I didn't touch on all of them because, of course, I only have so much time because Diana doesn't want to listen to me for longer than an hour. And there's more out there. You can always go to the UiPath Academy. You can go to the UiPath Forum. You can reach out to Priya, and she will lead you to all of the different exception planning tools because she knows that I was going to throw her under the bus like that, right, Priya? All right. So today we're going to talk about debugging.
Absolutely, Chris.
Testing. Huh?
Absolutely.
Today we're going to talk about debugging and alpha testing. Now I use the term alpha testing because I'm old school. I'm an old guy. I've been doing coding for a long time before UiPath. So I call it alpha testing. That's just when you're building your automation, you're testing your code. So my first suggestion to anybody that's a developer is you're going to just create a quick sandbox. I have 2, and they're just blank templates. And if you're building a regex statement or you're building a select statement or anything like that, you're doing a lookup. I always test it in my sandbox first before I throw it into my automation because it's easier for me personally to find errors in my sandbox. It could just be a simple, let me see if I can open my sandbox. I typically end up with several sandboxes because I fill them so quickly. But I find that it's going to be very helpful to you. Let me open my sandbox. If you have something simple that's just sitting out there that you can just start building a couple of statements in, if you want to test a regex statement, you want to test a date conversion, especially if you're trying to get to some environment dates. You want to test some tricky code thing you learned on the forum. You're not sure if it's going to work, but someone put it out there and says, hey, this works for me. Then we just throw it into something like this. And this is a new one. I have one that has about 80 of these little blocks in it, and I start to get confused, so I just keep starting them over. And you just build in that. That's what I do as part of my what I call alpha testing. When I get into an automation and I start putting what is kind of new and nifty, if I'm bringing in a VB statement or something like that, and I put it into my RE framework or my linear framework, then I'm going to start doing some alpha testing within my framework. And I do that in the test panel. And I kind of totally destroy the testing mechanisms that UiPath has. So I'm going to show you, and I found one today that I can show you that doesn't have any cool information that will make me lose my job at GameStop. All right. So I go down here to this test framework. I don't use the test suite. And again, I'm not saying anything bad about the test suite. I just don't use it. Like I said, I'm old school. If you want to learn about the test suite, then let Diana know in the chat. She will hook you up with somebody to teach you the test suite. I do old school stuff, so I'm just going to show you what I do. You have these test modules down here. When you start opening these test modules, you're going to find that there's a lot of stuff that's there already. It didn't used to be this way back in the old UiPath days. So I just always go to the process test state and I delete everything that's in there but the initial all settings block. That's going to bring in my config. Okay. And then I always build in.
Hey, Chris, are you sharing your screen right now?
Am I not?
I see some PowerPoint slides.
Yeah, he
Oh.
actually is sharing his screen.
You want me to try and reshare?
Are we supposed to be seeing something other than PowerPoint slides?
Should be seeing a studio. Hold on.
Chris, we are looking at your agenda slide only. You might want to share your entire desktop. It might be stuck with just a
Hold on,
program.
let's see. What do you see now?
Yep, we see the studio.
Okay, sorry about that. That's called old age, is what that's called. All right, and 4 and 5 monitors. Okay, so what I do is, let's just use an example. I'm just going to do this guy. I always use the process test case, but you'll notice, like I was saying, you're going to have a lot of stuff that's already pre-populated. UiPath did not used to do this. So I just kind of go in there and I delete everything but what's in this guy right here, initial all settings. It's really the only thing I really need to do start doing my alpha testing. Alpha testing to me is I always build in code segments. Okay, I never build an automation from beginning to end all within one code segment. And the reason I do that is because if something changes in one part of the code segment, like this is processing a template, if something changes in one part of the code segment, like logging into a system, I don't have to rebuild my whole automation. I just need to build that code segment. And then I only need to test that code segment and not the entire automation. So I build in these invoke codes, and those come up here from this little new drop here, guys. And I will always use my personal opinion, and if you're in my COE, you're always going to use the flowchart one. We don't build a code segment that's in sequence. If you want to get really complicated and use a state machine, you're welcome to, but I just generally say, okay, use a flowchart because it gives you more flexibility. And to do my alpha testing, I take everything out and I just start putting my code segments in there. Now, when you change your arguments in a code segment within the test scope, within these tests, you can put your arguments in here, whatever you want to put your arguments in here, okay? And they're not going to change the arguments that are in your general framework. What will change is if you're in this code segment and you're doing some debugging and some alpha testing, and you have to change one of these blocks, that will change what's in your RE framework or your linear framework. So you need to be careful that what you change in here, you realize that this is, again, your alpha testing. So if you change something in here, you need to understand that that changes may have been made in your primary workflow or your primary framework. If you just do your arguments, that's not going to impact what's in your framework. Okay. If you hard code a variable, that will change what's in your framework. So just be careful that whatever you do in here, you're making sure when you go back to your framework that anything that you changed in this test scope is also in your framework, all right? Or is removed from your framework if you tested something in here and it totally didn't work. That's why I use the sandbox. Because again, I'm old and I get confused sometimes. And I can often have 3 or 4 automations up on my screen that I'm working on simultaneously and kind of get that a little mixed up. All right. And you can see in my process state, and this is a linear framework, in my process state is this process input template that I've thrown into my process test case. Now, to debug your process test case, you're not going to go up here and hit debug because this is going to debug your automation. I'm just going to right click on this guy and debug my file. Okay. Now, when we're doing alpha testing, we want to make sure several things. We want to make sure we have, if you need a lot of data, if you're working with a lot of transaction data, you need a lot of transaction data because you're going to consume some of that when you're building. You're going to consume some of that when you're alpha testing. And then you're going to consume some more when you're debugging the entire thing. So you want to make sure you have plenty of test data, plenty of test scripts, plenty of test scenarios, because you're going to eat them up, okay? And so you want to make sure that when you're BA, if you have the luxury of having a BA, or if you're working with the business team prior to build, that you anticipate the amount of test data or test scripts that you're going to need, because you don't want to get into the middle of a build and get into a middle of a debug and run out of transaction data. If you cannot then turn that transaction data back around to be reused, then you need to make sure that you have enough transaction data to use. We will always do our test and our debugging in a aside from our studio that we're going to do now, when we're going to take whatever we build here and we're going to put that into our orchestrator test environment. we have a test bot. And that test bot, its only job is to do testing, and it only hits test environments for applications. If you happen to be working in an application where the provider, the third-party website, your company, whatever it might be, does not have a test environment for you to play in, then you need to make sure that you're not breaking anything in production. And you need to make sure that the business understands that we prefer not to test in a production environment because we can change data in a production environment, and sometimes you may not even know you're changing data in a production environment. So you want to make sure that you have a test environment. Very often in my COEs or in my organizations, we will turn down automation opportunities if we don't have a test environment to play in. Okay, just a note of caution for you. All right. So if I want to debug this file, now you notice I set a toggle point here, and I'm going to take that off. Right. So I set a toggle point here because I want to stop it right when it starts hitting this, because I'm going to step into this. All right. Now you can sit there and you can go into your automation. You don't need to, but you can, and you can toggle everything in there, and the bot's going to stop at every toggle point you put. And to toggle something, you're just going to right click on it and toggle it. All right. That's going to tell the bot to stop when you're doing your debug. Now, if you don't want to go through all that hassle, we're just going to do a step into. So I'm going to take that toggle off again. I'm going to go back to my process test case. Well, here I'm going to go ahead and toggle this one because I'm in my test case. Okay. And I'll show you how to do that framework itself. All right, now if I were to click on this, and I'm going to hit my debug, you're going to see it churn, and it's going to do some conniptions before it's going to start. And you're going to see your test panel up down here. Now you can notice the bot stopped automatically on the first part. Okay. And over in this panel, this is the favorite part of debugging. Now you should debug absolutely everything you build. General rule is to debug everything you build. And we don't even now, and this may be in Chris's world of unicorns and rainbows. In my world, we don't ever put anything into production unless it's been debugged. And we will typically, during a code review, require that whoever built the automation debugs the automation in front of us. So again, you're going to need more test data to do that. We want to make sure that we can capture any errors that may impact a production environment through debug. Okay. Excuse me. So over in this panel over here, you're going to see all these little categories. Now, these are all going to be all of the variables you've created in your workflow. Okay. Now you can notice everything's null or false because you've stopped it at the beginning step. All right. So if I go into a step into, your debug's going to step into this sequence, and it's going to go to where your first thing is. Okay. And you can see that nothing's changed here yet because you haven't gone past this point, right? So the bot's just telling you what this is doing. So if I do a step into again, come on, I just hit the wrong thing. Sorry, guys. Pause. Forgive me. Someone's looking in my window. Hold on. Sorry about that. All right, let me do a debug again. I'm going to take this guy off. And this is just for demonstration purposes. I'm going to toggle into this one. I'm going to toggle something in here so I can get past the first steps. And since this isn't in my framework, I'm just going to toggle something here just to make it stop. Let's just toggle right there. All right, now let's go back into my test case. I'm going to do a debug, and it's going to stop at that toggle I did, but it's going to get past that first scenario. And it's going to go through its conniptions. Sometimes the conniptions take longer than other times. If you have a job that is code heavy, your conniptions at the beginning are going to take longer than they would if it was a small area. Who comes in? He's still initialized. Maybe we'll go here, maybe we won't. Let's see what we do. Here we go. Okay, so we stopped at the filter data table, this table for sheetrock. And you can see up here that a lot of the variables and tables and things have already been encountered by the bot, have been populated, whatever it might be. So if I wanted to see what was in my array, I can click in my array and I can see what files the bot brought into my array, right? If I want to see my DT, what's the data in my data table? I can go in and I can see what the data in my data table that the bot has filtered down to looks like, right? So you can see that you can click through these and see, here's my clone. You can see what the bot has been populating. Here's an aggregate total of something that the bot just calculated before. I can see what the bot's done already up to this point. I can't see what the bot's done after this point, only up to this point, right? And I can continue running it. And if I continue running it from this spot, it's going to run through the rest of the automation because I didn't set any more toggles in this. And this again is in my test case, okay? So I'm just testing this code invoked code segment, okay? So you can, the point I think I'm trying to make is you can filter through here and say, okay, so on this section here, right, I may want to see what's coming out of this filter data table. Well, if I know that filter data table, if I toggle the filter data table, it's not going to tell me that. It's only going to tell me after that's been done. So if I toggle here, right, then when the bot stops here, I'll be able to see with this doors gate data table, right? So if I continue, it will eventually get me to this data table. I'm particularly interested in what this filter pulled out for doors gates DT. So if I look at doors gates DT, I can see that this is all the doors gates information that's in my data table, right? Now, if I had put my toggle here, I would not have seen what it's filtered out for this doors gates DT. I hope I'm not confusing you. If I am, I apologize, right? Now, if you're in your framework and you're debugging your framework, you can start at the beginning of your framework. Let's stop this guy. And forgive me, my computer's overheating. I have 2 minutes stuff open, so I apologize. If I'm in my framework and I were to toggle, and let's say I'm going to, if I wanted to toggle this guy and stop him here, my frameworks can go all the way through. Let's do something. Let's see if we can get that. We may not. I'm not going to be able to do that on this because it's going to process some data transactions I don't want to process. If I were in my framework and I was debugging using this key up here, debugging my file, and I started it, the bot's going to stop here, okay? When the bot stops here, I can start doing what we call step into. Let me get back into a debug on this part of that because I can't debug the whole thing, guys, sorry. They won't let me, or I'm going to eat up some data that I really don't want to eat up because then I have to reset it. So let's get back to where we had a toggle in this real quick. And I'll show you some of the other debugging tools. And while it's doing its little conniptions, keep in mind, I may be telling you things that you already know. And hopefully, if you're developing, you already know this stuff. But for those that don't, hopefully this helps you understand a little bit about debugging. It is probably one of the most important tasks you can undertake as a developer is to debug beforehand. Now, if you're just debugging, here we go. We stop. And lucky for you, you made me stop talking. All right. So I can, if I do a step into, let's say if I was stopped at the top up here, If I had a toggle here and I did a step into, if I clicked in a step into, it's going to go into this guy, right? If I did a step over, it's going to go to this guy. Or if I had more than one thing in here, it's going to go to the next guy in here, right? If there's only one, like in this path exists, it's going to go to this guy, right? If I did a step out, it's going to take me out of that certain sequence that I'm toggled into, right? It's going to take me to the original spot, If I did breakpoints, I could set both, I could have it toggle to the next one, okay? And it shows the breakpoints panel, which is down here, okay? Shows me all the toggles that I have into my automation so far, right? If I did a restart, it's going to start my debug back from the beginning of my debug, right? If I did a focus, that focus is going to take me to the last focus area where I had an error. Okay, so I may encounter an error or an exception in here, and I want to see if there's any more exceptions during my debug. Then I can do a continue and keep continuing beyond that, or do an ignore, and I can ignore that exception. This ignore is going to be grayed out until you get into an exception. And I could do a retry. It's going to be grayed out until you run into an exception. You can have it retry it just so you can see where your exception is. This is really important if you're building. These are going to be really important tools if you're building within an RE framework and you've got within your process flow, you've got several of these invoke scopes, right? And let's say in one of these invoke scopes, you've got you're throwing a BRE, a business rule exception within the invoke scope. Let's say that. And you've put your business rule exception, which you should be doing, into a try catch, right? So you're trying your business rule exception. Keep in mind that if you're throwing a BRE within here, that BRE is going to be captured within here, right? It's not going to be rethrown into here, into your process. So what you need to do in your catch is you're going to have to rethrow your BRE, business rule exception. You're just going to rethrow it, right? And you can see that set up in this as it is now, your business rule exception, okay? And your exception, right? So this is your higher level. Doing a rethrow is going to rethrow it to that higher level. Typically in my automations, we're not going to throw BRE within the invoke scopes necessarily. And if we do, it's going to be at an end scope. So it's going to be at the end of the automation. So it goes to the output. It goes to the end state. You may run into an automation, you're building a complex automation, for example, where you're within the automation and you have several opportunities where you need to throw a BRE, okay? And you may run into a situation where let's say this happens a lot in SAP, where you're going through a screen in SAP or a BOPI and something didn't populate or something's not there that you need because the data wasn't entered correctly or something, and you need to throw a BRE to stop that automation. And you're rethrowing that BRE in one of your invoke process workflows, in one of your things you have in here, your invoke codes. And you may have several other invoke codes down here. And these other ones have different BREs. So you want to rethrow that BRE into this process so that your process state takes your BRE and takes you to the end state, okay? If you do not rethrow it, if you have several in here and you do not rethrow it in a catch, now rethrow is only going to work in a catch. It's going to continue going. You're going to fault your automation. And you're going to consume data and you're going to have some production data that you need to clean up or stop. And I hope that doesn't confuse you. All right. So when you're debugging, you don't, like I said, you don't need to set a toggle point at each one. You can just do a step into, and it'll step into each separate activity that you built code into. And then you can, as you progress beyond the last step, it will start to populate your panel over here, and you can start looking and identifying where there are errors. When we talk about BREs, if you do throw a BRE, You're not it's not gonna take you to the end of your debug. It's gonna give you a message over here. Okay, and it's gonna stop, right? It's gonna just give you a message, and you still can handle it the same way you're handling your debugging now. You can continue, and you can restart to make sure where the BRE hit, or you continue and the automation will continue. The only time you're gonna have a problem with that is if in your process test case, you didn't bring this guy in. Because you'll or your config file is open on your screen. You'll immediately get a message. And when you try and step into that, the bot cannot do that because it's your config file. And it's going to keep going and going and going and keep giving you the same error, same error, and same error. You need to close your config file, bring in your initial all settings, make sure your arguments are set correctly here, and then you can restart. So you're going to have some problems with these guys if your config file is corrupted, open, not populated correctly, the bot cannot get it, or it's this whole segment right here is not here. You cannot just retry this guy without this guy here, right? Otherwise, you'll be able to restart, step out, step over, continue, focus, retry. If your config file's in here, and you can jump through these hoops for you. All right. Now I'm in my process test case here, so I'm not gonna be able to demonstrate it, but I can step through every one of these just by putting step into. You can do a slow step and have the bot just keep going and pause and go really slow through your automation. If you want to watch it step through everything, I like having more control over my debug environment. And I start doing my step intos. I don't mind clicking a button. Okay, this is easy for me to click. I can examine what I'm seeing, I can examine what's going on, and I can find out where a possible exception may occur, right? So I can see right here, if I'm looking at my aggregate value, I'm gonna have to do some rounding in there, right? So I can say, oh, that's, Chris, you forgot to put the round 2 in there, or round 4, or whatever it is that you need to round into. So I can go back in there and put my math round code into this aggregate number so that I get a more accurate picture that the business can use. Okay, so that's why we require everybody in our COE is required to do a debug when they build, and we suggest that you start by doing alpha testing. Let me close it, stop this guy, and my computer is hot enough that I can cook my ramen noodles against it. We start by telling you that we want you to do alpha testing. Alpha testing is using this guy right here, one of these, and testing your code segments. Alpha testing again involves having some sort of sandbox, testing your regex statements, testing your select statements, testing your VB code, invoking your invoke codes, your invoke methods, testing all that in your sandbox before you throw it into your automation, so that you know what you're putting into your automation, even though you're going to debug it again, is working in your sandbox. Your sandbox should have the same packages, the same version of packages. Should have your same packages, the same version of packages as what your automation you're working on. You can change your sandbox as much as you want to because you can delete it. It's not going to do anything. You're just using it to build, right? You're using it to test complex ideas that you have. You're using it to test different things that you're trying to bring into your automation. Maybe you're trying to do some different navigates. You want to make sure the URL is correct each time. You do that in your sandbox, and then when you put it into here, you can go through and you can do cleaner debug. And your debug will be more effective for you because you're going to find things in your debug that you weren't necessarily finding in your sandbox. And they'll be more refined because your sandbox is already working correctly, right? So that's debugging and alpha testing. One of the most important things you can do as a developer is debug. And you should make that a general rule for yourself that you need to debug everything. And as you know, I don't like doing clicky bots. We talked about that for 2 sessions in a row now. You will get your selectors in your clicky bot in your debug panel. If your bot fails on a selector, it's going to show you what the selector you had chosen is. But it's really not going to help you debug that unless you actually go in there and see if that application, if the selectors change. So I avoid clicky bots. I would rather do a navigate to or using an API when I do my automations. So there are some limitations on debugging. You'll be able to see what your data tables look like. You can see what calculated variables are. You can see how your dates are pulling in. You can see where there's no values. Why is there no value? You can see what your lookup files, your lookup data tables are pulling in. You can see how your link statements are coming in and your enumerables and how all those are coming into your automation just by looking at your output panel. And if you have, again, any BREs or anything like that, it's just going to give you a red message. It's not going to start anything over. So you need to be aware of that. You think in your head, why is it not stopping? I put a BRE in there. Why didn't it restart? Because I put a system exception in there. It's just going to show you that in your red panel because you're in debug. All right. Talked a lot. Debug's fun. You can't break anything. You can only fix things with debug. But make sure, again, you have plenty of test data, especially if you're a newer developer, you're still trying to get the feel for things. You're not sure if you've got everything corrected. Make sure that you understand even debug is going to consume test data. So you want to make sure that you have you have enough test data or recyclable test data that you can use or test scripts that you can use without. Because in some systems, if you're building in a test environment and your test environment was refreshed with data 30 days ago from the production environment, you're still going to be changing that test environment data. And so you may not be able to reuse the script or the transactions in your test environment until they refresh data again, you have a new set of data. So make sure that you have plenty of test data in order to do debug, alpha testing, and coding. Questions, anyone? Or is this going to be one of those sessions where I don't have any questions because I did such a good job?
Please feel free to take yourself off mute too, if you have any questions.
Priya, did I miss anything? Yeah. Priya. I think I put Priya to sleep, Diana.
I think so. Any questions? Do you guys have any questions about the other two sessions that you thought of either? You did a great job, Chris.
Well, if you have any questions, as always, you can send them to Diana. She'll end up filtering them to me, and I will answer them for you. If you need me to sit with you and go into more detail about anything, we can set up a Zoom. I have a personal Zoom I can use, or we can work on somehow connecting our teams together, and I can walk with you through those things like that. I do it all the time for other people, so I don't mind doing it for you as well.
Well, thanks again, Chris, for hosting the session tonight.
Hi, Chris. This is Suresh here.
I'm sorry?
Hi, this is Suresh here. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah. Can you show a snippet where some VB script or some other data script is invoked, and that how do we debug that? Do you have any code like that?
If I have a VB script, is that what you're asking?
Yeah. VB script or C# script, which is invoked from UiPath, and what is the best practice to debug? How to do that?
How to put a VB script in your automation? Is that what you're
and
asking?
how to debug that? Yeah.
How do you debug your VB script? You debug your VB script the same way you would debug anything else. Your VB script should be pulling in your VB code because you're going to store that VB script in a text file, correct? So your VB script should be stored in a text file and referenced in your config file. Ideally, right? Because you're going to bring in a VB script, invoke VBA or invoke the VB script, right?
Yeah.
And what you're going to do if you're using these is you're going to reference the file where it's at, correct? So when your bot goes and grabs that VB script from your text file, you're going to debug it the same way as you would anything else. It's going to debug that VB script because you're referencing it in your config file. You should never have a hard-coded VB script. Now, if you're doing a VB script in this manner or a C#, I don't know if this is one we want to use. No, that's not it. If you're doing an invoke method, let's see, hold on. We don't want invoke method because invoke VB script has changed. Invoke PowerShell. I know what you're talking about. Let me see. I know UiPath has changed some things in the newer model. Hold on. No, I don't want to mess this up. Bear with me one moment, guys. I'm still in my test case. That's okay. Code. Okay, you're talking about using this, correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so if your VB script is sitting in here, it's still going to debug your VB script just as it was sitting out in a text file, right? Or your C# script, right? It's going to still do that. I would recommend, I'm going to tell you, to be honest with you, when you invoke if you invoke C# or something like this, you could use this panel. If you're invoking VB, I would put that VB code into a text file and reference that in my config file, because you may run into a situation where you have a VB code that works. Let's say we're doing an SAP BOPI, right? And you know, in an SAP, you can set up some scripts in SAP, some VB scripts, and you can incorporate those into your automation, right? So you can run, if you need to run 4 different BOPIs in SAP, a BOPI being a business API in SAP, you can put that in a script, a text script, and the bot will refer to that text file and invoke that VB code. And the reason I tell you to put it into a text file and reference it in your config file and not use this if you're doing VB, because what happens if your code changes, right? That means you could either go in here and change this and retest all this, or you can just change your config file, that text script, refer to it in your sandbox and test it that way, right? So I would prefer, that's what we do, and that's how I do my VB tech, and when I invoke different codes into my automation, is I'm going to store that code in a text file and have the bot incorporated into that. I do that with my SQL statements. I do that with select statements. I do that with my VB code. I personally don't do a lot of C# in my automations. I prefer to do the VB because that's just what I'm more familiar with. Does that help?
Yes, yes. Yeah, Krish. Yeah, thank you very much.
Anyone else? Okay, well, everybody enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you for attending tonight's session.
Thanks, guys.